This is 530i, 5-speed manual. Swapping out front struts and control arms and rear shocks. And this is the engine support bar. It supports the engine while I drop my front subframe in order for me to get to my oil pan gasket. And while I'm in there, I'm going to also replace the oil pump nut. This is a notorious issue with this particular engine. Somehow, some way, the nut becomes loose and stops feeding the oil into the engine. So that's a big issue. So this is a preventative maintenance for me. And also swapping out engine mounts. All right, let's get right to it. First, safely jack up the car and remove the lug nuts to take off the wheels. Alright, here I am installing my engine support bar. There is a hook on the front side of the engine attached to the vanos, and this is where you latch onto in order for you to keep your engine in place when you remove the front subframe in order for you to replace the oil pan gasket. And now let's remove the under tray, and this is held on by Phillips head screws. Starting with my front driver's side, I'm going to turn all the way to the right in order for me to remove my brake sensor, and the caliper, and the control arms, and the strut. To remove the caliper, there are two 16mm bolts. Using a bungee cord, I'm mounting away my caliper so that it doesn't hang on the brake line. Removing a 22mm nut on one of the control arms from the hub assembly. On the other end, 16mm socket with the ratchet for the bolt and 18mm wrench for the nut. Using a ball joint separator, separating the control arm from the hub assembly. Now turning the steering wheel all the way to the left to remove the inner and outer tie rod. Removing 22mm nut from the outer tie rod ball joint. Removing inner tie rod using an adjustable wrench separating from the steering rack. Again with the ball joint separator, separating from the hub assembly. Next, removing the sway bar link, and you do have to use an adjustable wrench to hold the back end of the ball joint to remove the nut. And these are 16mm nuts. Removing brake sensor cable and the speed sensor cable out the way to drop the whole strut assembly. And the speed sensor is right behind the hub, and this is held on by a 5mm hex bolt. Removing the 22mm nut from the second control arm, and there is a cover for the other end, which is held on by two 10mm bolts, which exposes 18mm nut and also 18mm bolt. And to remove the hub assembly from the strut, it's held on by 18mm nut and 18mm bolt. Okay, I am taking out the ball joint of this control arm by putting the nut back onto the threaded shaft because I do not want to damage the threaded shaft and widen it, and you may not be able to take out the control arm from the hub assembly. And be mindful that this particular control arm can only be taken out when the hub assembly is off from the strut. So check your control arm bushings and everything before swapping out or considering to swap out the strut, so you can do it all at the same time. And removing three 13mm nuts to remove the whole entire strut assembly. Alright, do the same thing for the passenger side, and let's remove the front subframe. Alright, to drop the front subframe, there are two 18mm bolts hiding behind this plastic guard, which are held on by 10mm bolts. And in total, there are six 18mm bolts holding the subframe and two 13mm nuts holding the engine mount. And I should have done this before. I should have removed my steering rack, which is held on by two 16mm bolts. Okay, in order for me to drop the subframe, I did have to take off my steering rack, and it was held on by 16mm bolt and nut, bottom and top. And then this hose here, it was held on by 10mm nut. And the whole front subframe drops. Before taking off the oil pan, I'm going to drain the oil, and it's held on by 17mm bolt. After draining all the oil, putting back the draining plug. And this was a little tricky angle, but you do have to remove the oil dipstick, which is held on by one 13mm bolt. You do not have to take the whole thing out. As long as the O-ring is out of its position, it should be fine, and you should be able to drop the oil pan. And these are the only E12 Torx bolts holding the oil pan from the transmission housing, and there are 3 of them. Unplugging the oil level sensor out the way. And these are long 10mm bolts, and there's only 4 of them, and I put them together with the E12 Torx bolts. Alright, here comes the easy part. Everything else is the same exact size, and once they are off, the oil pan comes off. Alright, here is the oil pump nut I was talking about, and it's also reverse threaded, so lefty, tighty, righty, loosey. Again, lefty, tighty, righty, loosey. Alright, here is the upgraded part. There's a hole in the nut, and the metal wire will hold on to the sprocket, so it will never come off. And torquing the nut to 18.4 foot-pounds. Making sure the oil pan is clean and the gasket area is clean, and I am using 2 zip ties to hold the gasket in place because it tends to fall once I try to put everything back together. And I'm putting them on kind of loosely, not too tight, so it's easy for me to cut off. And once I install the bolts back on, I just cut the zip ties off and put everything back together. Here I am cutting the zip ties away and putting all the bolts back on, and it's all the easy part. And they are 10 Newton meter or 7.4 foot-pound torque. And it's important to tighten the bolts in crisscross pattern to ensure even pressure on the gasket. Oil dipstick going back on the oil pan. And 13mm bolt to mount the oil dipstick. Reconnecting the oil level sensor cable. I unfortunately forgot to record the engine mount, but right before installing the front subframe, you can swap them out. And there are 6 18mm bolts for the front subframe, torqued to 57 foot-pounds, and then 2 13mm nuts for the engine mount, torqued to 15.5 foot-pounds. And then reinstalling the steering rack, and these are torqued to 35 foot-pounds. And let's get with the new components here. I'm going to compress my strut assembly first using this tool, compressing tool I got from Amazon. I think I spent about $100 and I think it's worth it. Look how safe it is for me to compress right inside my kitchen floor. So I'm going to replace the strut mounts, bump stops, and the seals, the rubber gaskets and all that with new Koni struts. Okay, and before decompressing the spring, the seating of the position is very important. So if you look at the strut, it's almost like a triangular shape, and there are 3 sharper edges. So starting from 1, that's where the spring end begins, wrapping around 2, and so forth. And the strut mount torque specs is 25 foot-pounds. Moving on to the control arm, and the curved one goes on first onto the hub assembly. And make sure the left side, the driver's side, right side, the passenger side is properly aligned with the hub assembly. And once the control arm is onto the hub assembly, I'm going to mount it onto the strut, and it's held on by 18mm bolt and nut. And the torque spec is 60 foot-pounds. Moving on to the inner and outer tie rod, I'm going to install the boot first onto the inner tie rod and then mount it onto the steering rack. Here I am aligning the control arm to the chassis and bolting down the outer tie rod onto the hub assembly. And as for the tie rod nut, I'm going to torque it down towards the end. And here I am inserting the bolt and nut for the control arm. And this will be torqued down to 81 foot-pounds. Now the control arms and tie rod ball joints to the hub assembly will be 122 foot-pounds. Installing the speed sensor to the hub assembly with 5mm hex bolt. And this is the headlight leveler sensor. And if you don't have this, you don't have to worry about it. But if you do have to install it with the control arm earlier. And now installing the caliper back onto the rotor. And lastly, installing the sway bar link onto the strut and the sway bar. Completing the front side with this control arm cover, which is held on by two 10mm bolts. And let's get to the rear shocks, and you do have to take out the rear seats, first removing the rear dome lights. Exposing two 10mm bolts for the rear C-pillar trim. And yanking out the rear seats. And to remove the rear parcel shelf deck, remove these plastic clips. And this actually was one of the challenging part of this process. The headrest do not come out until you remove these pins underneath the rear parcel shelf deck. And removing the rear speakers, and they are held on by two Phillips head screws. And finally, underneath it all, exposing the nuts for the shock mounts. And unfortunately, to get to the shock itself, we do have to remove the caliper and then the rear control arm. and removing this control arm will allow more space for the shock to come out. Compressing the rear spring. Also replacing the shock mount and the bump stop. Okay, let's put the shock assembly back in its place. And then the control arm. And then putting the caliper back on. And very last job is to fill up oil, 6.5 quarts, and done for the day. Thanks for watching.